When I talk to people in these agencies, we might not agree on all sorts of things. One thing they do agree on is they say, I wish we could go back to the immigration focus that we had prior to 9/11, instead of all this headache of counterterrorism mumbo jumbo that we're talking about now.
Yeah.
And so I think that's the point that has to be made rather than the legal one, because I guarantee you start flipping through national security law, you're not going to be satisfied with what you see.
Trump stole $12 billion from us, the American taxpayers, and gave it to Israel illegally, and not a single goddamn reporter will ask about it. And so I'm sick of it. And if someone can prove to me that it's not stolen and there was actually a vote on it, I'm very happy to be corrected. But until then, Trump stole $12 billion from all of you to give it to his beloved Israel because they bribed him with over $300 million. That's Sheldon and Miriam Adelson, who are Israelis and hate this country. They flew Jonathan Pollard, a traitor, out to Israel on their private jet. That's how much they despise our country and are traitors to it. Now, let's go to our former TYT contributor, Ken Klippenstein. Check him out on Substack and support him there because he's doing brilliant work. Ken, welcome back, brother.
Hey, so good to be with you again, Cenk.
All right. So, Ken, you had a couple of interesting news stories about the Department of Homeland Security. First, tell us about your source telling you about lists that they're keeping of so-called domestic terrorists.
Yeah, so they have been tasked formally to take pictures and identifying information of anyone who's taking pictures of them. That's it. They don't have to be doing anything else. So protesters standing on the street taking a photograph of an ICE agent or a Border Patrol agent or anyone in the task force, that's enough. That's sufficient cause for them to run your license plate, to take a picture of you and use the biometrics, bring that back for what was described to me as a run-up by intelligence, which is kind of an informal way of saying they're going to run you through a database and see what they can find out about you so they can map your associations and try to figure out, as was described to me, what this network of actors is, because the Trump administration is convinced, without any evidence that we've seen publicly, that there's some kind of orchestrated effort to fund and bankroll and motivate these protesters.
Yeah. Well, look, so on the funding of things, I totally get it, because the right wing is doing projection. In almost all the right wing protests are financed by some corporate interest, and they don't know that. The people going to the protests don't know that at all. But of course, the famous case of the Koch brothers pulling up with giant buses for the Tea Party guys with messages that help their corporation and abuse the American people, on and on it goes. So they assume the left is doing it as well. But Ken, I wanted to ask you, they're putting this as so-called domestic terrorists. That's super scary. I want to come back to that. But take away the title. Is any part of this program seemingly illegal? Or can they go, okay, you went to a protest, your left-wing protest or a right-wing protest, I'm now going to gather all the information I can about you and keep you on a list?
I think the scariest thing about it is that it probably is legal, because President Trump designated quote unquote Antifa as a domestic terror group, the first such designation of any domestic American group publicly via executive order like that. And from that and NSPM 7, presidential memorandum he promulgated last year, that gives extraordinary power to the intelligence community to target Americans with a lot of the same sorts of tools that they used against groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, foreign terrorist organizations, real ones with financing and institutional structure, almost like states. They can use all of that now against what the administration considers to be Antifa. And when I was reporting on this early on, a big frustration of mine was it was sort of met with skepticism on the part of a lot of people who said, oh, there's no such thing as Antifa. But guys, this is Trump's definition of Antifa. He might define that differently than you and I do. He might define that much more broadly than you and I do. And I think that's what we're seeing happen now.
Ken, this is tangential to the main conversation, and I'm going to get back to the abuse of our rights, et cetera. But I'm going to ask you a funny question. Is there even such a thing as Antifa? Because what I mean by that is, I get that some guys went to protest some years ago, and I guess they called themselves Antifa. So I'm not saying that that didn't happen. What I'm asking is there any infrastructure, as far as you can tell, any real organization? Because I've never seen it. It doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. That's why I'm asking.
I think it exists in the sense that Anonymous exists, the hacker collective from the 2010s or so, and that is to say, it's a word that people might use to describe themselves. But do they have a physical location? Do they have a PO box? Do they have an LLC? The answer to those questions is no. I mean, I assume there's some nonprofit out there, maybe somewhere, that has two guys that they call Antifa or something. But any kind of presence commensurate with those groups I was talking about before, Al Qaeda and ISIS, no way, not even close. Not even close. I mean, I've gone to these protests and kind of had some fun asking people, saying, "Are you Antifa? Have you seen the Antifa cell?" And a lot of people would say, "Yeah, I'm Antifa." Like, I would consider myself opposed to fascism, but it was clear that there's no, formal group or designation. So a lot of this is like what you said at the top of the segment, where there are these, I would go to protests and sometimes there would be maybe there'd be some Democrat group, present somewhere. That doesn't mean that everyone in the group is like being directed by them, or that's just the guys that set up the first thing. And then there's a lot of spontaneous participation on the part of ordinary people that want to go out and do something. It doesn't mean that it's all some orchestrated plot. So long story short, do I think the admin can find some shaky basis to say, oh, this guy has Antifa on his Instagram account or something? Yeah, I'm sure. And that's why I'm very skeptical of the idea that the law is going to protect us here, because they can find, just like with statistics, you can make a case with anything. And that's how the law is for national security in this country, unfortunately.
But Ken, one more thing about that. Any source you have in intelligence and Homeland Security and the government at all ever show you anything that says, yeah, this money from Antifa headquarters or a funder that it doesn't call themselves Antifa, but is a funder, has gone to this branch of Antifa or that branch of Antifa? Because I've never seen that in the news. They just say like, oh, Antifa is this or that, but I've never seen any facts regarding that at all, especially when it comes to funding. But again, I don't want to miss it. Have you ever had anybody show you evidence like that?
Well, I have seen one intelligence report, and you're going to laugh at my saying this. It was based on, they have some kind of commercial database that they can trawl through and find information about people. And I'll report this at some point. And they described someone as being a key figure within Antifa. And so I am, leafing through this intelligence report. And I realize their evidence for that this guy's Antifa is like you were saying before. He had Antifa on his profile on his social media account or something. And they take that to mean, oh, he must be a critical node within the structure. So a lot of what's happening is these guys were trained and came up in what's called the global war on terror, fighting those groups I was describing before, Al Qaeda and ISIS. And so the way you go about fighting those groups is the theory was to map out the structure and figure out who's financing it, where are the fighters, where are they being trained. They're taking that exact same approach. Someone like Kash Patel, the FBI director, came up in that exact war on terror, and that's what they've been trained to do. And so that's what they're applying to this, very loosely organized group, to quote Trump's first FBI director, who he fired, a loosely affiliated just idea, not a organized group. And so I have seen an intelligence report, but that doesn't mean that it exists in the sense that you're asking me. It just means that some guys in a room got together and convinced themselves that it does.
Yeah, so no checks or anything that they've gotten, that they've tracked. Interesting. Look, I don't want to give them any ideas, but the analogy there is, it's like I call myself a populist. Populism is not a group, it's not an organized infrastructure, but there's tons of populists in the country, right? And from time to time we organize as in, hey, let's go and do a protest, or let's go do a petition. Is that a group now? No, it's just populism. And by the way, you could say that about capitalists, you could say it about Marxists, you could say it about almost anyone. That's just a general term for folks. But okay, now back to the main point. So what happens if you're on this list? Do you know if there's any ramifications yet?
So what was described to me was that Border Patrol in particular, who is central to this whole ICE operation, we use ICE as shorthand, but ICE is really the task force that's in charge. It involves a lot of Border Patrol agents too, because they can operate within 100 miles of any border, which happens to include where most of Americans live. They are taking this. I know that they're taking this information back and they plug it into a database called IRS. I can't remember exactly what it stands for. I'll have a story about it shortly. And what that does is it spits out information about where they live, their home address, property. They're running their favorite thing to do is run license plates. And if you look at the video that was posted a couple days ago, where one person was just photographing the law enforcement, this was an observer. He starts taking pictures of her license plate, and she says, "Why are you doing that?" And he says, "Because we got a nice little database, and now you're going to be a domestic terrorist. So have fun with that." An ICE agent actually said that on camera to this woman who, as far as I can tell, wasn't doing anything but just taking a picture of him. So I went back, talked to my own sources. They said, "Yeah, we plug it into this database that gives us this whole network of information to kind of profile these individuals. And what we do, if you try to see, do they have outstanding warrants? Can we tie them to other actors that we're watching? All based on this worldview that there's some kind of orchestrated cabal that's pulling the strings behind these things, as opposed to what I have seen when I go and talk to protesters, which is just everyday people that want to get involved and care about it. And there is no big structure behind the scenes. So as I understand it, that's what's going on with this intelligence collection.
Yeah. It's interesting because you mentioned they're basically trying to treat American citizens like they would with ISIS or Al Qaeda. And I'm a little bit worried about something I've called Israelification of our government. That once you label someone a terrorist, as Israel does, then you could do anything you want to them, including killing them. And because they're enemies of the state, they're the boogeyman, they're the terrorist. And so I don't know if there's any crossover from the, but I guess you're saying the guys that were, is it? So let me ask you the fourth question, because again, I'm not sure, and I think you might know. Like, so when you say the guys who are fighting ISIS and Al Qaeda, were they like, because I know law enforcement now is working with the IDF in a lot of different ways. Did those guys ever work with the IDF? Is this idea of calling Americans terrorists coming from somewhere else, or that just because of their work on ISIS organically came up?
There's definitely joint training between Border Patrol and other federal law enforcement agencies and the Israeli security services, if only because it's such a close ally of the US government, and they share so much stuff, not just intelligence, but resources and other things. But I think what's really happening is that we never really rolled back the calendar. It's kind of as if 9/11 happened yesterday, because a lot of the stuff that we created in response to it, the Department of Homeland Security being one thing, we never went back and said, okay, Al Qaeda is defeated, or it's not enough of a concern anymore. We can go back to how life was before. We never did that. We basically, the whole legal basis around those wars is still in effect. The DNA of the Patriot Act, exists in Homeland Security, which was designed to be a counterterrorism entity. And when you talk about ICE, which is obviously in the news all the time, that didn't used to exist under the Department of Homeland Security. That used to be a responsibility of the Justice Department. And so immigration was treated more as like a civil or criminal matter rather than a counterterrorism matter. And the reason that's important is because counterterrorism is a very aggressive approach. People hear the word, they just think it means you're taking it seriously. But what it really means is that you are stripping away the usual criminal predicate that you need in order to open an investigation, because you're trying to counter an attack before it has happened. You have to try to preempt it. And the reasoning behind that, which I'm skeptical of, but people seem to have accepted, is, if there's a terror attack that is so big like 9/11, it justifies us going around and setting people up and giving them the means to commit something, because the thought is it's so dangerous that we're going to take the gloves off and we're going to have an extraordinary approach to it that doesn't follow the usual rules of law enforcement. That's basically what we've seen with immigration. It has been elevated to a national security issue, has been treated as a counterterrorism issue. And that's why you have Border Patrol and ICE in the streets of not just Minneapolis, but major cities around the country responding the way they are with these masks and, we're calling any protester a terrorist or saying that they're impeding them. That's all that counterterrorism mindset. That would make sense in Fallujah. That would make sense in Iraq. But they haven't. They're using the same thing in American streets, which is just wildly out of proportion to any supposed threat there is, and it's really unhealthy because everyone has just accepted this. I don't see much in the way of Democrats, for instance, in this budget fight. They're like, let's get rid of Kristi Noem, let's get rid of Bovino, all of which is fine, but you're still allowing immigration to be run out of this counterterrorism entity, Department of Homeland Security, when you could just go back to how it was in 2001, right before the attacks. That's what needs to be debated now. And it's not, everyone has just sort of turned the page and accepted that this is how things are going to be forever.
Oh, the Democrats going along with the Republicans. That's got to be a first. And of course, 7 Democrats in the House voted to fund ICE along with the Republicans. In fact, if they didn't, Republicans would have lost that vote. So they delivered, as they always do, for their Republican friends. One silver lining out of this, I hate violence and for 100% nonviolence. And so good news is if you're on the left, by the way, also if you're on the right, if somebody comes and tells you that you should do violence, they're probably an agent. They're probably a literal federal agent, so don't listen to them and don't ever do the violence. Okay, now speaking of the right, Ken, Democrats are not necessarily inclined in this particular direction, although could be. Could they just turn this apparatus against the right wing? Guys, Trump came up with Antifa as a theoretical organized group when it isn't. And the Democratic president can say something that is far more organized are militias, right? And the militias do have weapons, they do have infrastructure, they have some degree of financing, they have a lot of anti-government positions, and they do protests and sometimes with weapons. So seems like it's pretty easy to weaponize this against the right as well.
Totally. I think that's why there needs to be a social pact that we're just not going to use the powers that we use against, basically quasi states like ISIS. We're not going to do that in this country because we believe in a free society, and because any threat that exists, however real, they're just not ISIS. Like as bad as things are here, I don't think we can say that it's quite that bad. So you're exactly right. And it's so short-sighted because when either party comes into the White House, they have an opportunity to change this, but they decide not to because they realize, oh, I could use this. And a lot of conservatives would say that that apparatus was used against people, for instance, on January 6th. And I'm sympathetic to that point. Not that there weren't people that should have been prosecuted, but I don't think it needed to be treated like a counterterrorism matter. It could have been treated as a routine criminal matter. But unfortunately, we revert to this thing because it's just, I don't know what it is. We never went back to pre 9/11. And you see this every time something terrible happens. People say, we gotta swing the counterterrorism sledgehammer. This thing is terrorism. And I don't think they quite realize what that entails. And we're seeing it now.
Yeah, if you've got a militia that's organized and they're going to attack someone or they're going to commit some sort of crime, I'm not saying don't arrest them. I'm saying don't use this nonsense rubric of terrorism, right? And take away their rights. No, they should have American rights. And then if they're going to commit a crime, we should do normal investigation, get warrants, and arrest them. So it doesn't have to be extreme, like we let everyone go or we call everyone terrorists. So speaking of which, like in terms of the extremes and how they're going to start to conduct themselves, what's going on with these? I don't want to say warrantless searches, but they have this excuse of an administrative warrant that ICE is now sometimes using. Help us understand that.
Yeah, so when you look at the immigration system, and I'll preface this saying I'm not a lawyer, a lot of people look to there being some kind of judicial process over it. What they don't realize is that the immigration courts, that's in the executive branch. They're not really a judiciary. And so they can have these things that are clearly not due process, where you have hundreds of people in the room and the judge just swings the gavel and they've made one decision for an entire group of people, because you don't have that same due process like imperative that the judicial branch does. And because of that, they can do all kinds of wonky things that I don't think they should be able to. But again, the law is not going to save you. Like, this stuff has to be debated on its merits. And I think that the way that you could go about doing that is saying, okay, from the perspective of the significant majority of the country that wants there to be aggressive deportations, specifically of violent felons. That's what there's a majority of support for, and that support collapses when you get outside of the violent felon kind of criteria. You should be asking yourself, how effective is this at that? How effective is it having Border Patrol basically being riot response or like essentially crowd control and following protesters around? And how many protesters has ICE and the Justice Department indicted for supposed impediment of law enforcement? How effective is all of those responsibilities at getting done that thing I just mentioned, deporting violent felons? It's not very effective. It's a huge waste. They're not trained in that. They don't know how to do it. They're not right for it. And they're immigration authorities. So they're not supposed to be doing this stuff, but because they're in Homeland Security, they've been kind of national security-ized, and that's how they approach everything. And so they have this, when I talk to people in these agencies, we might not agree on all sorts of things. One thing they do agree on is they say, I wish we could go back to the immigration focus that we had prior to 9/11, instead of all this headache of counterterrorism mumbo jumbo that we're talking about now.
Yeah.
And so I think that's the point that has to be made rather than the legal one, because I guarantee you start flipping through national security law, you're not going to be satisfied with what you see.
So Ken, let me give a Democratic example and see if I've got it right. I was furious when Barack Obama and Eric Holder said that they could kill Anwar al-Awlaki, who was a US citizen, without any kind of judicial process. And they said, no, due process doesn't have to necessarily be judicial process. It could just be the executive branch checking with each other. You want to kill him? Yeah, I want to kill him too. High five, we go kill him, right? So is that basically what's happening here with the warrants? They're not going to a judge. There's two guys on the Trump team going, you want to break into their house? Yeah. You want to break into it? Yeah. Here's your administrative warrant. Go break into their house. We're not asking any judge, and you don't need any stinking evidence.
Yeah, again, I'm not a lawyer, but I've covered national security for about 10 years now. And what I've learned is that whenever you flip through the law, you realize the courts are very deferent to the state when it comes to national security. And so that's not a fight that the public can often win. And the goal is then to move things outside of the domain of national security so that you don't have to deal with that stuff. Because just like you said, what you said is exactly right. Their argument was essentially the Constitution says that you need due process. It doesn't say anything about a court, about your day in court. So therefore, Obama calling up his buddy in the Justice Department, well, we consider that due process. And the courts are basically fine with that because when it comes to national security, both culturally and legally, they're obligated to basically defer to the executive branch. So it's very dangerous to have this stuff concentrated in the national security space because of that.
You'll know, guys at home, that we've got the right person in office the minute they start undoing those things. Because if they're a normal uniparty establishment, Democrat or Republican, they will never undo those things. And they need to be undone so we can get back to America and our Constitution. So Ken, we're running short on time, but I do want to ask you about one other topic, which is funding for Israel. So every once in a while, a news story will come out and they'll go, oh, the last one was Trump has given $3.3 billion in weapons to Israel. Or they'll say, which is hilarious because mainstream media are, in my opinion, are enormous liars. And so they'll say, Israel has bought these weapons. Then when you read into the 17th paragraph, like, yeah, bought them with our money. So it's absurd. So that part we know is a lie, right? So that I don't have to ask you about that. But 3.3 billion popped up a couple of weeks ago. And a couple of weeks before that, $8.6 billion popped up. And I read dozens of articles and no one ever clarified where the hell's this money coming from? Is it from the old memorandum of understanding where we're supposed to give them 3.8 billion a year? Is it a new appropriation? I don't remember anybody voting on a new appropriation. Is it from the next memorandum of understanding that doesn't even exist? So can anyone track all of the money we're funneling over to Israel? And does anybody even know if it's legal? Has Congress even voted on that 3.3 or that 8.6?
Well, again, national security law, it's like Calvin ball. I'm sure there's some very complicated and frankly ridiculous, calculations going on in the background that if you were to go over it, they technically check the boxes. Maybe it doesn't match the spirit of what it's supposed to be, but they will have technically checked things. And that's all the law is did you technically check the boxes? So to your question, you're not missing anything. It's extraordinarily complicated. I've gone through that exact same process when I've done stories on US aid to Israel, trying to even just get a handle on it. It's kind of like in Congress when they have poison pills and they have all these, they have all of these legislative tactics that they can use to try to obfuscate. I mean, we're talking about a big story now is Homeland Security funding. They had designed it in such a way so that the Democrats wouldn't have to risk being associated with voting for the budget and being seen as voting for Homeland Security in particular because of how they structured it. So they play all these games for that exact and express reason to make it difficult for you to come away with a top line figure. Because if that was possible, people would freak out just like they have about aid to Ukraine. Because it's an extraordinarily large number going to, unlike in the case of the Ukraine, an extraordinarily wealthy country. Israel is a rich, developed country. And so I think that's part of the reason that it's so hard to figure it out. And there's also very few people that ask. If you look at the think tanks that exist, it's just not something that there's very much appetite for.
No, you know who's in control when the media refuse to ask the simplest question. Where did that money come from? You can't get a simpler question if you're covering the government, national security, whatever your vertical is in your particular publication or your media outlet. If your job is to cover that and they go, hey, we just gave 8.6 billion to Israel, your first question would be, from what? Where did that money come from? And literally no mainstream media reporter dares to ask that question because they're afraid they'll be fired by some Israel first apparatchik inside their own organization. This is insanity. So until anyone clarifies it for me, and literally there is zero reporters in the country, I have asked, there is zero that can explain where that money came from. Until then, 8.6, 3.3, that's $11.9 billion. Trump stole $12 billion from us, the American taxpayers, and gave it to Israel illegally, and not a single goddamn reporter will ask about it. And so I'm sick of it. And if someone can prove to me that it's not stolen and there was actually a vote on it, I'm very happy to be corrected. But until then, Trump stole 12 billion from all of you to give it to his beloved Israel because they bribed him with over $300 million. That's Sheldon and Miriam Adelson, who are Israelis and hate this country. They flew Jonathan Pollard, a traitor, out to Israel on their private jet. That's how much they despise our country and are traitors to it. Anyways, that's me editorializing. So, all right, Ken, if you ever find out where that money came from, please come back here first and tell us. I don't want to get anything wrong, but for now, I'm going to assume that money is stolen. And so, open to finding, well, if we ever goddamn voted on it. That's how it's supposed to work in America, but unless you're Israel, no. I mean, imagine saying, oh, by the way, we just gave Portugal $12 billion. Why? Where did it come from? Shut up, right? You're anti-Portuguese and you'll be fired, right? You'd say that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. But it happens with Israel over and over and over again. So, okay, if you're fine with Israel being the boss of us, then you're not really that American, but okay, fine. But I'm not. Anyways, Ken, thank you for doing the journalism on it. If you find out any more information on that, we're all ears. And I can't wait for a day when we don't have all these abuses and we don't need Ken Klippenstein as much.
I would much prefer that. I mean, in some ways it's good for me, but I would much rather have it be hard for me to find stuff to write about.
Yeah, let's do a campaign to get the government so clean that Ken has to get a different job.
Give me a week off here.
So get him to transfer to another part of journalism, then we'll clean that place up, etc. So Kenny Clips, yeah. Legendary. Everybody check him out on Substack. Ken Klippenstein. Anything else, Ken, that you want people to check out on things you've written?
I will have a couple stories on the stuff that's going on with Border Chief Bovino shortly, and the mission in Minneapolis, which is way different than how it's being discussed by the Trump administration. I mean, they're trying very hard to project strength and certitude which does not exist within those agencies when you talk to people in them.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Ken. Appreciate it, brother.
Thanks.